16. Half of China. How sad it is to be a woman. Nothing on earth is held so cheap. Boys stand leaning at the door like gods fallen out of heaven. Their hearts brave the four oceans, the wind and dust of 1,000 miles. No one is glad when a girl is born, by her Tly family sets no store. Fu Suan. While the dramatic, violent, and often macabre scenes of the settlement of accounts and the exuberant, lively, often humorous incidents of the distribution of the fruits unfolded like the intricate plot of some day-long Chinese opera, another struggle began whose object was the liberation of women from the oppression of their husbands and from domestic seclusion. A few poor peasant women in Longbao, the wives of leading revolutionary cadres, early organized a women's association where brave wives and daughters-in-law, untrammeled by the presence of their menfolk, could voice their own bitterness against the traitors, encourage their poor sisters to do likewise, and thus eventually bring to the village-wide gatherings the strength of half of China, as the more enlightened women, very much in earnest, like to call themselves. By speaking pains to recall pains, the women found that they had as many if not more grievances than the men, and that once given a chance to speak in public they were as good at it as their fathers and husbands. As had been proven by Chen Mao's mother in that first district-wide anti-traitor meeting. But the women found as they organized among themselves, attended meetings and entered into public life, that they met more and more opposition from the men, particularly from the men of their own households, most of whom regarded any activity by wives or daughters-in-law outside the home as steps leading directly to adultery. Family heads, having paid sound grain for their women, regarded them as their private property, expected them to work hard, bear children, serve their fathers, husbands, and mothers-in-law, and speak only when spoken to. In this atmosphere the activities of the Women's Association created a domestic crisis in many a family. Not only did the husbands object to their wives going out, the mothers-in-law and fathers-in-law objected even more strenuously. Many young wives who nevertheless insisted on going to meetings were badly beaten up when they got home. Among those who were beaten was poor peasant Manti Esong's wife. When she came home from a Women's Association meeting, her husband beat her as a matter of course, shouting, "I'll teach you to stay home. I'll mend your rascal ways." But Manti Esong's wife surprised her lord and master. Instead of staying home thereafter as a dutiful chattel, she went the very next day to the secretary of the Women's Association, Militiaman Ta Hung's wife, and registered a complaint against her husband. After a discussion with the members of the executive committee, the secretary called a meeting of the women of the whole village. At least a third, perhaps even half of them, showed up. In front of this unprecedented gathering of determined women a demand was made that Manti Esong explain his actions. Manti Esong, arrogant and unbowed, readily complied. He said that he beat his wife because she went to meetings, and the only reason women go to meetings is to gain a free hand for flirtation and seduction. This remark aroused a furious protest from the women assembled before him. Words soon led to deeds. They rushed at him from all sides, knocked him down, kicked him, tore his clothes, scratched his face, pulled his hair and pummeled him until he could no longer breathe. "Beat her, will you? Beat her, and slander us all, will you? Well, rape your mother. Maybe this will teach you." "Stop, I'll never beat her again," gasped the panic-stricken husband who was on the verge of fainting under their blows. They stopped, let him up, and sent him home with a warning: let him so much as lay a finger on his wife again and he would receive more of the same cure. From that day onward Manti Esong never dared beat his wife, and from that day onward his wife became known to the whole village by her maiden name, Chiang Lin, instead of simply by the title of Manti Esong's wife, as had been the custom since time began. A few similar incidents, one of which resulted in an errant husband spending 2 days in the village lockup, soon taught the poor peasant men to be more circumspect in their treatment of their wives. Even if it did not teach them to appreciate women in public life any more than they had before. The institution of wife-beating was, of course, not ended in a few weeks by such means. But having once shown their power, the women did not have to beat every man in order to make progress on this question. Thereafter, a serious talk with a strong-armed husband was often enough to make him change his ways, at least for the time being. Cho Cheng-fu was a bare-poor peasant who got land and house for the first time in the distribution that followed the setting of accounts. Land and house made possible the acquisition of a wife. Through a go-between he made a match with a puppet soldier's widow 10 years his junior. Perhaps because of the difference in their ages, Cheng-fu proved to be a very jealous husband. He would not allow his wife out of his sight for even an instant. Over this issue they soon fell to quarreling. To settle the matter, he beat her, and she, being a woman of some spirit, went to the Women's Association as Chang Aileen had done before. Instead of retaliating against Cho Cheng-fu with sticks and kicks, the women sent a delegation to talk to him. They reminded him how hard it was for a poor peasant to get a wife at all. Once married he ought to treat his woman with great respect, be patient with her, and help her to overcome her mistakes, especially since she was younger than he. If he beat her she would only learn to hate him, their relations would steadily worsen, and in the end she might demand a divorce. In that case he would lose his wife completely. Since Cho Cheng-fu did not like the idea of a divorce he decided to be gentle with his wife thereafter. Later, when he went away to do rear service at the battlefront, he got a literate companion to write a letter thanking the Women's Association for their help. The letter was written in the formal style used by scholars of the old school. After I left home I thought it over and realized that you were kind enough to try and help us. Now know that it is only through mutual love and respect that husband and wife can live happily together and build a good life. When asked if, as a result of these actions, women had yet won equality, one of the leaders of the association said, "No, not yet. Things are a little better than before. Still, there are beating cases and most men still despise women's words and think women are no use. We have to struggle for a long time to win equality. When we have land of our own it will help a lot. In the past men always said, 'You depend on me for a living. You just stay home and eat the things I earn.' But after women get their share they can say, 'T got this grain from my own land and I can live without you by my own.'" Labor. When it comes to labor on the land, women can work just as hard as men even if they are weaker. They can do everything except plowing. They can even hoe if they can't hoe so fast. But they cannot drive carts. Well, even this they can do, but some of the animals are pretty hard to handle. It was not long before the Women's Association in some parts of the county set up plowing classes for women, and the fame of those who mastered agricultural labor spread far and wide. A widow in Shan settlement startled everyone with her strength and skill. She could do everything a man could do and more. She could even push a loaded wheelbarrow on the highway and earn $12 a day. Border region currency, transporting bricks. She was so skilled at planting that in the spring all the peasants in Shan settlement wanted her, and no one else, to plant their millet. In another village, only 5 miles from Long Bao, a woman was elected as village head. Women such as these were rare, but as news of their exploits spread, others were greatly encouraged. It would be very one-sided to imply that the only goal of the Women's Association was equality for women. Without the successful transformation of society, without the completion of land reform, without a victorious defense of the liberated areas against the probing attacks of the nationalist armies, it was impossible to talk of liberation for women. Many women realized this as if by intuition, and they made the Women's Association an instrument for mobilizing the power of women behind the revolution in all its aspects, behind the settling of accounts, behind the drive for production, and behind the defense effort. Through the association, classes were organized for literacy and for the study of politics, cotton loans were made to stimulate spinning and weaving, the women were brought together to make uniforms and shoes for the soldiers, and wives and mothers were urged to encourage their husbands, sons, and brothers to enlist in the army. All of these activities were intimately linked up with the struggle for equality, with the demand on the part of women that they should no longer be treated as chattels. If this demand alarmed the men, the all-out support which the women gave to overall revolutionary goals disarmed them and won from them a grudging admiration. in their hearts they had to admit that they could not win without the help of half of China.